Good morning. My name is Dean Bonner. I am the Associate Survey Director and a Research Fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring our latest PPIC statewide survey on Californians and their government. This survey was conducted with funding from the R.J. and Frances Miller Foundation and the James Irvine Foundation. We thank them for their support. We also thank the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle for supporting this virtual event. As a public charity, PPIC does not support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. For today's program, my colleague, Deja Thomas, will walk you through some of the key findings from the survey. After the presentation, we will discuss some of our main takeaways, and then we will answer questions from the audience. If you have a question about the survey, please send an email and include your name and organization to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. I would now like to welcome my colleague and survey analyst, Deja Thomas.
Thank you, Dean, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you all for joining us today and for your interest in this work. Give me one moment to share my screen. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge my co-authors on this report, which includes Dean, of course, as well as Mark Baldessare and Rachel Lawler. And I would also, again, like to acknowledge our funders for this survey, the R.J. and Frances Miller Foundation and the James Irvine Foundation. Without their support, this survey series would not be possible. This survey is part of our Californians and their government series, which has covered numerous state and national issues since 1999. And for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the PPIC statewide survey, its mission is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions, which we hope will be used to help inform and improve state policymaking, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. The PPIC Californians and their government series covers public perceptions, attitudes, and policy preferences. Since the start of the survey in 1998, PPIC has provided a voice for more than 400,000 Californians on more than 200 general, issue-specific, and regional surveys. This specific survey was conducted from January 16th through the 25th using telephone interviews, 77% of which were conducted on landlines and 23% on cell phones. Interviews were conducted in both English and Spanish according to the respondents' preferences. For this particular survey, we interviewed a little over 1,600 adults with a margin of error of 3.5. And the sample also includes about 1,000 people we consider to be likely voters, and the margin of error for that group is 4.6%. Oops, not that, wrong way. Okay. Excuse me. Diving right into findings from the report, we asked respondents to name the most important issue for the governor and state legislature to work on this year. And nearly 2 in 10 adults mentioned the coronavirus, and just over 1 in 10 mentioned homelessness or jobs, the economy, and inflation. Fewer mentioned crimes, gangs, and drugs, or housing costs and availability. Looking back, there's been a significant decrease in the share naming COVID-19 as the most important issue compared to last year. And we see that people are thinking about a much wider range of issues this time around. We find that Latinos and Asian Americans are most likely to name COVID-19, African Americans are most likely to name homelessness, and whites mention COVID just as often as they do homelessness when asked what they think the most important issue facing the state is. There hasn't been much change in Californian sentiment of whether the state is generally going in the right or wrong direction, since these shares have remained similar to the beginning of last year. Today, half of adults say things are going in the right direction. And across parties, Democrats are far more likely than Republicans and independents to say things are going in the right direction. And across the state, we see that half or more in Los Angeles or in San Diego and the San Francisco Bay Area are saying things are going right, compared to fewer in the Central Valley and Inland Empire. And about 4 months since an attempt to recall Governor Newsom from office, similar shares of adults and likely voters approve of his job performance. Since January 2020, these overall approval ratings have remained at above half. Democrats and independents are more likely than Republicans to approve, while Republicans are more likely to disapprove. Across regions, approval is higher in Los Angeles and San Francisco than anywhere else in the state. Fewer than half of Californians approve of the state legislature today, and this share has remained in this range for about 2 years now. Democrats are far more likely than independents and Republicans to approve. A year or so into his presidency, a slim majority of adults and nearly half of likely voters approve of the job President Biden has been doing so far. And this share is lower than a year ago, but similar to the approval we see for Governor Newsom today. And similar to Newsom's approval ratings, Democrats remain far more likely than Republicans and independents to approve of President Biden. Approval is highest in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles compared to other regions across the state. Approval of the US Congress remains low as it has in the past and has even decreased since a year ago. Today, about 3 in 10 approve of the US Congress, down from about 4 in 10 around this time last year. Approval ratings across partisan groups remain low. We also asked how well the governor and legislature and the president and Congress can work together to accomplish a lot in the year. And majorities of adults and likely voters are optimistic that Governor Newsom and the state legislature will be able to work together. Today, Democrats are far more optimistic about this than independents and Republicans. And when it comes to whether President Biden and the US Congress can work together, Californians are actually a lot less confident. More than 3 in 10 adults and only about a quarter of likely voters are optimistic. And since a year ago, when Biden took office, we can see how the share expressing this negative view has grown because far fewer adults and likely voters were pessimistic about them working together than they are today. And even as the US continues to grapple with the Omicron variant and high case numbers state and nationwide, we find that most Californians are actually optimistic. When it comes to where the US stands in the coronavirus outbreak, a solid majority say the worst is behind us. That said, in May last year, the share saying the worst is behind us actually peaked at 86%. So while optimism is still high, it has seen some decrease since then. Among partisans, 3 in 4 Republicans compared to 2 in 3 Democrats and independents say the worst is behind us, and majorities across demographic groups are optimistic. When it comes to concern over getting the coronavirus and requiring hospitalization, the share saying that they are very or somewhat concerned has increased after a steady decline during the last year. Still, a majority of adults today are not too or not at all concerned that they will get the coronavirus. Democrats and independents are more likely than Republicans to express concern over getting COVID, and across racial ethnic groups, we see that Latinos, Asian Americans, and African Americans are more likely than whites to say they are very concerned. Next, we asked Californians if they think the state is in a recession, and we found that about half of adults think so, with more saying a serious or moderate recession than a mild recession. Looking back at the past few months, somewhat similar shares have said this, while earlier in the pandemic, the share was actually much higher. We find that residents in the Central Valley, Inland Empire, and Orange San Diego are more likely than those in other regions across the state to say that California is in a serious recession. Lastly, the share saying that California is in a serious recession decreases with rising income and education. With rising inflation also becoming an increasingly larger problem as of late, we wondered how these price increases have affected Californians. And about 6 in 10 say that recent price increases have caused hardship in their households, including 1 in 10 who say that they have faced severe hardship because of these increases. While about half or more across racial ethnic groups have expressed that they are experiencing at least moderate hardship, this hardship is actually seen much more in Latinos than other racial ethnic groups, and more in lower income adults than higher income adults. And thinking about the US in general, today a majority think that things in the US are going in the wrong direction. And this share has actually increased since the beginning of last year. Today, majorities of Republicans and independents hold a negative view, while Democrats are more divided on this. Sentiment that the country is headed in the wrong direction actually increases with rising age, education, and income. There we go. And now that it's been a little over a year since the attack on the US Capitol, we asked Californians about their satisfaction with democracy in the US. Today, a slim majority of adults say they are very or somewhat satisfied, while likely voters are a bit more divided on when it comes to this. Democrats are much more likely to be at least somewhat satisfied, while Republicans and independents are more likely to be dissatisfied. And across racial ethnic groups, majorities of Latinos, Asian Americans, and African Americans seem satisfied, while whites are more likely to express dissatisfaction with democracy in the US. Tying in overall findings on satisfaction with democracy, we find that Californians today are divided when it comes to whether Americans of differing political views can come together and work out their differences. Interestingly, while this division exists among all adults, we actually see that a solid majority of likely voters express a pessimistic view on this issue. And unlike the differences in the previous question on US democracy, we find that majorities across political parties maintain a pessimistic view here. And across racial ethnic groups, a majority of white and half Asian Americans are pessimistic, while about 6 in 10 or so Latinos and African Americans are optimistic. Our survey covered other topics as well that I didn't get to talk about today, included but not limited to the support of Newsom's proposed budget plan for the next fiscal year, attitudes on getting the coronavirus vaccine, satisfaction with personal finances, violence, street crime and the police, and views on potential reforms to the recall process. I would encourage you to take a look at the crosstabs and the full survey report on our website if you have time. So that concludes this presentation, but I would like to remind everyone in the audience to please submit your questions at ppiceventquestions@gmail.com, and please include your name and the name of your organization with your question. With that, I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll turn it back over to Dean for the key takeaways.
Well, Deja, thank you very much for that very informative presentation. So much to cover always, and I've been in your shoes, so I know it's kind of tough to decide what to talk about. I'd also like to congratulate you on your first survey briefing here at PPIC, as well as thank you for your leadership in project managing this survey. I'd now like to kind of lift up a few findings that Deja presented, as well as highlight a few items that perhaps were not included in the presentation. So I was biking into the office this morning. I was really thinking about what struck me from this survey as I was, fine-tuning what I was going to say here. I really just kept coming back to this idea of these two narratives that emerged. One, the stability in views at the state level, and the really big changes that we've seen in opinion at the national level. To begin with, looking at the kind of stability at the state level in views on California and its leaders, we really see, as Deja mentioned, that the Governor Newsom and the legislature approval is basically unchanged from a year ago. But I think it's really poignant to look that Governor Newsom's approval actually ranged from 53% to 56% over 2021. And that's a very, very tight range there. And this is especially interesting given that it happened during a time when Governor Newsom was facing a recall. Additionally, 6 in 10 Californians continue to think that Governor Newsom and the legislature will be able to work together and accomplish a lot in the coming year. This trend includes a reading just prior to the pandemic, one on the heels of some of the worst months in terms of COVID cases and deaths last January, and today as California faces the latest surge. The stability can also be seen in the share of Californians who say the state is headed in the right direction. 50% held this view just prior to the pandemic in January 2020. 50% say that today. And in between those dates, we also found positive views about the direction of the state. Deja, I wanted to bring you in here for a moment. You've started working at PPIC just about a year ago, so you've kind of been here throughout this kind of time of stability. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on kind of what we've seen over the last year.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, Dean, we're seeing stability in approval ratings for the governor, as well as his handling of the coronavirus. And I think at the very least, people are constantly looking to our elected leaders and officials for guidance, especially as we learn more about COVID and its variants and how to combat against further spread. And over the past year alone, California has reopened in terms of the pandemic and then seen another surge in cases. And I think people are still looking to, right now, Governor Newsom and officials for guidance on that. And I think a lot of people in the state have seen, a positive change from past policy and legislative decisions. And I think that's why a lot of these approval ratings have maintained at the same level, but a little bit they're more positive.
Yeah, that's a good point about the kind of COVID approval for Newsom, which has been steady as well during that time. And we can contrast that with what we've seen at the federal level. A year ago, Californians were optimistic. President Biden took office along with majorities in the House and the Senate. However, since then, opinions have really plummeted. In our January 2021 survey, President Biden had an approval of 70%. This is noteworthy because that's almost identical to both our first and our last reading of President Obama in 2009 and 2016, respectively. This number is also noteworthy because it's actually twice as high as our last reading of approval of then President Donald Trump in October 2020. And so that's, really poignant to kind of put him in that position. However, since then, approval of President Biden has dropped by 17 points, including double-digit declines across nearly all political, regional, and demographic groups. Notably, residents in the Orange San Diego, independents, Asian Americans, and African Americans all saw declines of greater than 20 points. As you mentioned, approval of Congress, which was at levels we had not seen since 2009, last January, actually fell 10 points in this survey to a point similar to similar to what we've seen in the past. And lastly, I'd just like to add that the share of Californians who think that President Biden and Congress will be able to work together fell 33 points since last January, including double-digit decreases across all political, regional, and demographic groups. And it's notable that while we also found declines of greater than 20 points from year one to year two with President Trump and President Obama at that time, this decline actually surpasses that. And so I was curious, Deja, you've done a lot of polling at the national level. And I was wondering if you've seen kind of other trends or during your time doing national surveys that kind of mirror these big changes that we've seen in California regarding the federal mood over the last year.
Right. Well, obviously it's been a year since then, but I do recognize a little bit of a trend, especially when we're switching from a Republican president to a Democratic president, for example, that it seems like a lot of people start out with a lot of optimism. And of course, there's a political angle to that, but these shares also tend to mellow out or even decline, kind of like what we're seeing among Californians today with President Biden's approval ratings. And I don't know if I've seen a decline so great in the past, but I think there is maybe something happening here in relation to our current situation and that California and the country is in right now, especially with continuing uncertainty about the pandemic. And I think a lot of people might be looking for more at the federal level, but it seems that they're still waiting.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I promise we're going to get to questions shortly. You can send those to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. But there was one more finding that I wanted to highlight. As Deja mentioned, crime was mentioned among the most important issues for the governor and legislature to work on. 7% of Californians held that view this year. To put that in perspective, just 1% of Californians last year said that, and just 3% in 2020. And this perspective, which is seemingly backed up by actual crime data, can also be seen in the share calling violence and street crime a big problem in their local community today. A record high 1 in 3 Californians view this as a big problem today. That's a 10-point increase since 2 years ago. And this increase can be seen across most groups, but especially among residents in LA who saw a 16-point increase, and also among Republicans, college graduates, and those with higher incomes who all saw double-digit increases in terms of this. I could go on for a while here, but I do want to get to the questions. I do encourage you, as Deja did, to kind of look at the survey report and time trend data, as well as encourage you to keep an eye out for blogs from the survey team, including one which is already up on our website by Mark Baldessari that looks at potential reforms to the recall process. Before we get to the questions, I do want to kind of ask you, Deja, as reporters often do, what's one thing that really struck you by surprise in this survey?
I actually mentioned this very briefly in the beginning of my presentation, but I was most surprised by the mentions of COVID-19 as the most important issue this month. Last January, we saw that 43% said COVID was the most important, and now we're seeing it drop all the way to 19%. And that struck me because it just seems like there's a much wider range of issues that people are mentioning compared to a year ago, even though back then we were in I would say like one of the tougher times of the pandemic. But back then we saw that there were just 3 issues at 5% or more mentioned, while this month, we're seeing 7 issues mentioned at 5% or more. So I think that there's a lot that has been brought into light over the past couple of years, and many people are having to juggle with multiple issues all at once. So that might be why we're seeing a drop in the share mentioning COVID and a widening net of top issues.
Yeah, That's a good point. Last year it was like 6 in 10 who said either COVID or the economy. So today we do have a wide variety. So now we're going to get to some questions from the audience. Once again, PPIC event questions at gmail.com. If you have any questions, please submit them. But our first question is from the audience, wondering if there were any questions or responses towards energy in California. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this month we didn't ask any questions about energy because it's usually part of our environmental survey series, which will be coming soon. But there was a small share that mentioned gas prices as a top issue, and I believe that should be 2 or 3%, but I can double check on the crosstabs, and everyone can see them on our report website, on the website, and in the crosstabs as well.
Yeah. There was a small share as well mentioning, as you said, climate change and the environment.
That's right.
And so, those are some of the things, but I think with so much going on, we will be taking an in-depth look in that in July, which will also look at the most important environmental issue in that month. So another question from the audience, the survey covered a wide range of topics. And I thought since you got the chance to kind of answer something about the surprise question, I thought I would kind of take this one this time. Because the question was about, has anything surprised us? And I think for me, one of the things that has been surprising is that while we've seen the share of people who are getting vaccinated for the coronavirus increase and is up all the way to 82% today, there's a small, stable group of about 1 in 10 that have since last year continuously said that they would definitely not get the coronavirus vaccine. And this is across during times where the cases were higher, cases were lower. And so that I thought was interesting, as well as the fact, the question that we asked about, does the Omicron variant make you more likely to get the vaccine? And in fact, there was just 11% of unvaccinated folks said that this has made them more likely. And if you look at just the folks who said they probably or definitely won't get the vaccine, among that group, it was just 2% who said the Omicron variant would make them more likely to get the vaccine. So these are very kind of sturdy and stable numbers that we've seen in regards to that. Another question from our audience. The survey shows a recent drop in Californians saying the US is going in the right direction, but also a recent uptick about the state's direction. What do you make of this difference in outlook?
Yeah, I'll go ahead with that. While majorities think the US is going in the wrong direction, people are much more divided when it comes to the state. And I think part of this question might be answered by looking at the shares that say either Newsom and the state legislature or Biden and US Congress can work together. When it comes to whether Newsom and the legislature can work together, a majority say that they will be able to. But when it comes to whether Biden and Congress can work together, these views are flipped, with Californians far less optimistic. So essentially, people are more optimistic that leaders at the state level can work together than they are when it comes to leaders at the federal level. And that might be why we're seeing those that particular drop and uptick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have another audience question. This one's kind of about how we do the surveys. Do you ask a follow-up question to determine why people approve or disapprove of Biden, Newsom, or the direction of the country is headed? What do you think might be some of the factors that might be influencing that? I guess I can start to say that we don't necessarily follow up any of these questions with a why. Those questions tend to take a little bit more time, and therefore is something that we're mindful of, given we do have a limited amount of questions that we can include in every survey. And so, but we do try to get into some of the whys around some other issues, but not necessarily some of these. Do you have any thoughts on that, Deja?
No, I think you pretty much covered it. I guess if we did have space and time, we would love to ask all of the questions that we could. Yep.
Yes, as Deja said, there are many, many questions that we would love to ask on a monthly basis that we just don't have the space to. We have another question. The issue of vaccine equity has been a key one during COVID. Does the survey shed light on any continuing disparities?
Right, it actually does. An overwhelming majority of adults have reported being vaccinated, but this definitely obscures some of the disparities among demographic groups. We see that majorities across racial and ethnic groups say that they've already gotten the vaccine, and this ranges from 90% of Asian Americans and 79% to 79% of African Americans. And older adults are a lot more likely than younger adults, and college graduates are more likely than those with less education to report getting the vaccine.
Yeah, and we have seen some narrowing in those gaps, especially among racial ethnic groups, as well as some of the age. One thing we have seen is a consistent political divide, where we consistently have found about one in 4 this month, but even upwards to 1 in 3 Republicans saying they won't get the vaccine, while much smaller shares of independents or Democrats do say that. But I should point out that the majority of Republicans also are vaccinated, so it's not like there's less than the majority. It's just that there is this kind of sizable minority that continue to hold that position.
Mm-hmm.
Another audience question: does the survey look at either higher education or housing?
This particular series usually does not go in that direction, but we do have the higher education or the education survey that we started doing annually. I will note that for this survey, we saw that 5% of people mentioned education as the top issue for the governor and state legislature to work on this year, and 7% said housing and housing availability.
Yeah, and of course the larger share saying homeless, which is kind of adjacent to the housing debate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and as Deja noted, we'll be coming out with the survey in April, as we have been on K-12 issues. That also does normally have a few questions about higher education. And I can say that definitely housing is on our kind of list of things to cover in the early part of this year. And so we'll definitely be getting to that in due time. Another great question. Could you talk about the survey's findings on concerns about crime, especially in terms of the recent trend? Also, does the survey show any differences in terms of parts of the state?
Right, so while these didn't make it onto the report, I'm happy to talk about them now. Today, a solid majority say violence and street crime is at least somewhat of a problem, including 34% who say it is a big problem, and this share has actually increased since the last time we asked this question 2 years ago. And as for regional issues, regional differences, we're seeing that across the state. More say it is a big problem in Los Angeles at 41%, which is higher than any of the other regions across the state.
Yeah, and it's also record high saying that it's a big problem, and record high saying that it's just a problem overall. So it is, we have seen these increases. And yeah, double-digit increases across most regions and across many racial ethnic groups, across men and women. And so it's definitely a trend that we're going to try to come back to, because it is obviously something that's on the minds of Californians. So here's an interesting question. So the findings on price increases and hardship are interesting, and it's valuable to see breakdowns by race, ethnicity, and income. Were there any notable variations across subgroups that you found?
Right, so I touched briefly on the differences across subgroups. when it comes to the hardship people are facing due to these recent price increases. But I think it's interesting that the partisan and demographic groups that expressed being hit hardest are among Republicans, Latinos, and adults with high school education only, as well as lower income adults. And across regions, we actually see that residents in the Inland Empire are more likely to say they're experiencing hardship, severe hardship, compared to slightly fewer in other regions.
Yeah, I also thought it was interesting, given a lot of the debate during the pandemic has been about the impact on women in California and the nation. And we do see a difference in hardship when it comes to women are about 13 percentage points higher to say that they are experiencing hardship. And so I thought that was interesting, as well as just, the stark divide across income, but also education. It's, 3 in 10 of Californians with just a high school education say they've experienced a severe hardship, compared to just 9% among college graduates. We also see this across income groups, where I looked at the lowest income group that we look at, below 20,000, and 37% were actually saying that they experience severe hardship. So that's actually higher than the 1 in 3 in the 40,000 and under group. And then if you go all the way up above 80,000, of course, it's just 7%. But if you kind of keep going up, the 100,000 above, 200,000 above, it's very low numbers there. And so I think that's really notable. I did want to just see if you had any thoughts about kind of why we might be seeing this really stable group of folks who aren't kind of switching topics. This really stable group of about 1 in 10 folks who are very adamant that they're definitely not going to get the COVID vaccine. If you kind of, it's been a stable number. So that's kind of interesting that even as we've seen some ups and downs, there really hasn't been any change in that 1 in 10.
And I think looking back at past few months when we've been asking this question, the demographic breakdowns of this group of people hasn't really changed as well. We see that a lot of the share saying they definitely won't get the vaccine are Republican. They also tend to be white, and I think men are more often than women to say that as well. Yeah. So in terms of why not, I would actually love to know the answer to that question.
That's a great question. That a follow-up of why would be really great. And yeah, it is noteworthy that there are groups that are disproportionately represented among the group that actually says that they definitely will not get the vaccine. So well, I think at this time we have no more audience questions. It's been really a joy to talk with you, Deja, about this, as well as the audience. Some really great questions today, as always. But I would like to say that as a reminder, that we've reached into the program, and I would like to thank you, Deja, for your presentation. I would also like to thank our survey funders. And finally, thanks to all of you for joining us today. If you did pre-register for the event later today, you will receive a survey, because we kind of like doing surveys. And we would appreciate if you would take a couple of minutes to respond to let us know how we did. That's all for today. So please have a safe and a very good afternoon. Take care.